general meeting and the notes of John Bois part 2. So we're going to be getting part 2 of that here this morning. Just a quick reminder, next Sunday we will have class, but Eli is going to be teaching. We are working in the fourth Sunday of the month generally as an opportunity for some of the other brethren to continue to work and develop their skills at teaching. So Eli's going to be teaching next Sunday. We will have class, and then I'll be back the first Sunday in October, and we'll go a couple Sundays, and then we're going to be preempted by the Bible conference, and I think then Blake is going to finish the end of the month, as far as I can recall. But anyway, Sunday, September 18, Lesson 180, Pre-1611 Evidence for the Text, the General Meeting and the Notes of John Bois, Part 2. Let's get right into the introduction. Last week in Lesson 179, we resumed class by reviewing some content from prior lessons about the notes of John Bois and the general working timeline. In doing so, someone asked a question about the general history of the notes between when they were written by Bois in 1610 and when they were printed by Ward Allen in 1969. Now, if my memory is right, I think, Bart, you asked that question. You probably don't remember, but I remember being asked the question, so I tucked it away last week and thought, okay, will I be able to do anything to sort of talk about that issue? And I think we're going to be able to do that here this morning. So I'll try to outline that history in the next point. Now, this is sort of just a general approach statement here in the next bullet point. The notes of Bois represent the only primary work-in-progress document that we have not yet discussed in detail. So we've talked about Manuscript 98, we've talked about BOD 1602, I've mentioned the other ones that are available there's just not enough material on them for us to necessarily study with any depth, okay? But I've mentioned all of them. This is the only one that we have left sort of to talk about with any depth. So after giving it much thought, I have elected to cover Bois's notes in conjunction with a discussion of the general meeting. Given that Bois's notes are the only known primary source document to record the discussions that took place at the general meeting, this seems like this course of action seems appropriate. So what I originally thought I was going to do is be able to talk about Bois's notes, talk about the general meeting. As I sat down to actually write the lessons, I realized that wasn't possible because the notes are on the general meeting. It's almost impossible to sort of segment them and talk about one in distinction from the other because they're so interrelated. The notes that Bois took were on the meeting. How do you talk about his notes without talking about the meeting and vice versa? So as we cover this content, we're going to be sort of doing both at the same time. I hope that makes sense to you as far as that sort of just point of order, if you will. Before discussing the relationship between Bois's notes and the general meeting, I would like to address the history of the notes in a general sense. So this point that I've added is related to a question that Bart asked that he doesn't even remember asking. So, well, we're going to cover it anyway because I think it's important and it was a good question nonetheless. So the first major point is a brief history of John Bois's notes. The following history is taken from Ward S. Allen's 1969 book, Translating for King James, Notes Made by a Translator of King James's Bible. According to Allen's footnote citations, his historical sketch is based on the following, okay? So number one is the Ireland manuscript 7053, pages 125 to 129. That's in the British Library, I believe. Second is F.H.A. Scrivener's The Authorized Edition of the English Bible, 1611. Its subsequent reprinting and modern representations from 1884. Third, Alfred W. Pollard's Records of the English Bible from 1911. And then Anthony A. Wood's Athena Oxenos, which is his history of some things related to John Bois. And this was first published in a document in print in 1848, and that's of course publishing things that were originally written on a handwritten manuscript, which we'll get to in a minute. So the sketch that I'm going to quote here is from Ward Allen's 1969 book, and he is basing it on these documents right here is what he is basing this sketch on. All right, so drawing upon these sources, Allen paints the following historical picture regarding Bois's notes. Quote, this will be a fairly long quote. In the year of our Lord, 1643, and in the reign of our sovereign Lord, the King, Charles the 19th, John Bois Sr., prebend of the Cathedral Church of Ely and rector of the parish church of Boxworth, set his hand to seal to his last will and testament. First, he gave and bequeathed his soul, quote, unto the hands of Almighty God, from whom I first received it, nothing doubting that he will restore it unto me again at the general resurrection, and desired for his body decent interment according to the custom of the Church of England. Secondly, he distributed land, money, furniture, silver, custom in the Church of England. I'm sorry, my eyes went to the other line. He distributed land, money, furniture, silver, spoons, and a trunk full of fine linen to a son, a daughter-in-law, 2 grandchildren, and a servant, money to the poor of the parish of Boxworth, to the Church of Boxworth for reparation, to the poor sort living in the city of Ely, those who did service in the choir at Ely. In the midst of his settlements of all manner of things for all manner of persons, Bois was most elaborate and most specific in guarding the disposal of his books and papers. For books and papers, quote, may easily catch harm. 2 books he gave in thankful remembrance to St. John's College and the University of Cambridge. He listed the books in his library that were borrowed, and he begged that they might be restored to their right owners. So he knows the volumes that he had borrowed from somebody else, and he wants them to be returned to the people he borrowed them to, or borrowed them from, I should say, on his death. 2 books were to be returned to the Right Reverend Father in God, Ralph, now Bishop of Exeter, who I hope will pardon my boldness in filling the margins, or that's the margins, of one of his books with such notes as came to my mind. So he's annotating a book that he borrowed from somebody else. The bulk of his books and papers Bois left to his daughter Anne Bois. However, in the end, that they might be skillfully regarded and duly looked unto, he entreated his good friend, Master John Killingworth, now dwelling at Boxford, and supplying my place there to be aiding and helpful to my daughter in the disposing of the foresaid books and papers to her best use and commodity. So the point there is Bois taking very great care with the distributing of his books and papers when he dies. Okay? He's laying out how he wants these things to be looked after, how he wants these things to be handled. No doubt in this cache of papers that now are going to be the responsibility of his daughter Anne to take care of when he died would have been his own handwritten copies of the notes from the general meeting on the King James Bible and what happened at Stationers' Hall there in 1610, early 1611. Among these papers were the notes which Father Bois had kept when he served with the Company of Review, which supervised the printing of the authorized version of the Bible. Dr. F.H.A. Scrivener, biblical critic and reviser and editor of English Bibles, had written, quote, could these notes be recovered, they would solve many questions of great interest. He added wistfully in a footnote to that statement, quote, they were no doubt sold and may yet be found in some private collection. Professor Alfred W. Pollard, biographer and scholar, has speculated, quote, if the notes which Bois treasured so carefully to the end of his life had been preserved, it might be possible to trace, if only for a single section, the work done at different stages of the revision. So, are these guys aware of the fact that these notes would be exceedingly important and insightful in giving us understanding about the process of creating the King James Bible? All right. Next line. The fine linen mentioned in Bois's will has vanished. The silver is gone. For 3 centuries, the notes which Scrivener hoped to see recovered and Pollard despaired, were believed lost. Had it not been for the care of another clergyman, a skilled antiquarian and collector, so they might be still. In 1643, when Bois was testifying to his will,
William Fulman, born in a place famous as the home of Sir Philip Sidney, Penhurst in Kent, was 10 years old. He was the son of a carpenter. According to his contemporary and friend Anthony Wood, I don't know how you would say that, Fulman came to the notice of Dr. Hammond, the local parson, who procured him a cloister's place at Magdalen College, Oxford, where the lad was well grounded in school learning. He became a scholar at Corpus Christi College. Being a zealous son of the Church of England, he was ejected by the parliamentary visitors, but was eventually restored upon the king's restoration. So let's just talk about that quick. So during the English Civil War, when the Puritans took over the government, this guy, being an Anglican, was removed from his position. When the English Civil War was over and the monarchy was restored, this guy was reinstated back into his position. That's what that means, okay? He was created Master of Arts and made Fellow of his house. Finally, Fulman was presented to Recover of Messy Hampton, where he finished his course. He was a most excellent theologist. Anthony A. Wood writes, quote, admirably well versed in ecclesiastical and profane history and chronology. He had a great insight in English history and antiquities, but being totally adverse from making himself known, and the choice worth treasured up in his great learning, did in a manner die with him. But his learning did in a manner live also, for after his death, early in the morning of the 28th of June, 1688, William Fulman left behind a great heap of collections, neatly handwritten with his own hand, but nothing of them perfect. These he bequeathed to Corpus Christi College, Oxford. Among the papers are chronicles, antiquities, genealogies, calendars, lives of churchmen, memorials of learned and famous men, and of poets. That looks like a zero, not an O.
Yeah, that's right.
Of poets, a collection in all of 22 volumes. So this guy, Fulman, leaves the Corpus Christi Library 22 volumes of handwritten manuscripts of like all kinds of random stuff. Okay? Among these papers are 29 pages of notes taken by Bois, one of the translators of the King James Bible. So the manuscripts that we talked about yesterday are copies of Bois's work. We do not have Bois's original of the notes that he took, but this guy Wood and somebody else, this guy Fulman, excuse me, and somebody else at some point hand copied Bois's notes. Thus we have two manuscripts surviving today that we talked about last week in lesson 179. We have the Fulman manuscript that was done by this guy that is being discussed in this lengthy quote by Ward Allen, and then we have the Harl copy that was found by Dr. David Norton in the mid-1990s that we discussed also. Okay, now look at the next point. These notes, so we're on page 3 for those of you who are following along online. These notes, copied by Fulman, lay dormant until the publication of Gustavus Payne's 1959 book, The Learned Men, which contained a photo of the Fulman manuscript. It was this photo of Bois's notes in Payne's book that prompted Ward S. Allen to search the archives at Corpus Christi College, Oxford, for the missing notes. Finally, in 1969, Allen published Translating for King James for the Vanderbilt University Press. So that is the story of how the notes made it from Bois's desk and pen at the general meeting to ultimately being published by Ward Allen in 1969 in his book Translating for King James. Okay? So let me finish this point and then we'll take any questions. Olga S. Oatfeld wrote a short history of Bois's notes for her chapter on the general meeting. Let's change that to in her book, The King James Bible, The King James Bible translators, Ophel's paragraph reads as follows, quote, "The Bois notes disappeared for centuries. Then, in 1958, in The Learned Men, Gustavus Payne quoted several excerpts from a manuscript, quote, notes by John Bois at the Bodleian Library. It was, he exclaimed, a copy of 39 pages of Bois's notes. Some 10 years later, Ward Allen tracked down the manuscript, which belongs to Corpus Christi College, and published it together with annotations and translation of the Greek and Latin words. The copier was William Fulman, a 17th century Oxford scholar, rector, and antiquarian. But apparently he had worked at second hand, for at the end of the notes proclaimed, quote, transcribed out of a copy taken by some unskilled hand, very confused and faulty, especially in the Greek. Okay? Payne suggests that the Greek is abbreviated. Now that statement does not mean that Bois didn't know Greek and was terrible at what he was doing. That statement means that whatever Fulman copied, the person he was copying, so apparently he was copying a copy, did not necessarily write very clearly, is what he is saying there, okay? The notes run only from Romans to Revelation, with addenda on 1 Corinthians through Revelation. They're a mixture of English, Latin, and Greek, with references to patristic and classical sources. So again, folks, I try to impress upon you, Bois is writing in Greek, Latin, and English as he's taking notes. So imagine being skilled enough in those languages to be overhearing a conversation, taking part in 3 languages and being able to take notes on it. It's pretty crazy. I mean, this guy is as sharp as they come, all right? So before we go on to the next point, anybody have any questions? Okay, so that brings us then on the bottom of page 3 to Bois's notes in the general meeting. In Manifold Greatness, the Making of the King James Bible, editors Helen Moore and Julian Reed paint the following overview of what transpired at the general meeting at Stationers' Hall in London in 1610. Quote, after the 6 companies had finished their work, the general meeting comprising 12, or in some accounts 6, translators, delegated from the companies met at Stationers' Hall in London. The review process probably took place over 9 months in 1610. One of the members of the final review committee was John Bois of the Second Cambridge Company, which translated the Apocrypha. So Bois was the representative of that company at the meeting, along with another name you're going to be hearing a lot about, Andrew Downes, who was also a part of that. More on that later, okay? Now, this general meeting, so that understand, the companies have done their work, and they have turned their work over now to the general meeting or the committee of final review that is now going to go through the entire thing a second time and make any last minute, or I call it last minute, but any changes that they think still need to be made to the text at this general meeting or meeting of final review. Now, this meeting was called for by the rules that have been set forth by Bishop Bancroft at the beginning of the process way back in 1604. Okay, look at the next point, top of page 4. Top of page 4, a general meeting such as this was called for in the rules set forth by Archbishop Richard Bancroft to govern at the inception of the project. I don't like that sentence. I need to fix it. It's awkward and clunky. Basically, the rules were set forth at the inception to govern the process. And then look at Rule 10. I have Rule 10 quoted here. This is what Rule 10 said. Quote, if any company upon the review of the book so sent doubt or differ upon any place, to send them word thereof, note the place, and withal send the reasons. To which if they consent not, the difference to be compounded at the general meeting, which is to be of the chief persons of each company at the end of the work. So, does Rule 10 call for a revision, a final review committee from the chief members of each of the companies to gather together and then go through and smooth out and discuss any outstanding questions, difficulties, disagreements, or what have you related to how the text should read? Okay, so a general meeting at which Bois took notes is completely consistent with Rule 10, which calls exactly for said meeting. Everybody with me so far? Any questions? Okay. Olga S. Opfeld, author of the King James Bible Translators, offers some additional perspective on the size and scope of the general meeting. Quote, in 1610, all was in readiness for the critical board of review to meet at Stationers' Hall in London. Wrote Anthony Walker, the biographer of John Bois, quote, the whole work being finished and 3 copies of the whole Bible being sent from Cambridge, Oxford, and Westminster to London, a new choice was to be made of 6 in all, 2 out of every company to review the whole work, and extract 1 of the 3 to be committed to the press. So the idea is that the work of each group was, the master work of each company was sent. So the work of the two companies at Cambridge, the 2 companies at Oxford, the 2 companies at Westminster is sent to the general meeting, as well as representatives from each company. Okay. Now, if there are 6 companies and they are sending 2, 2 times 6 would be, at least theoretically, how many people? 12. Okay. However, as with many things related to the history of the King James Bible, there are some disagreeing reports or discrepancies that we will be talking about here shortly. Okay, so the whole work being finished. So I'm in the paragraph there. Start with wrote Anthony Walker, the biographer of John Bois. The whole work being finished and 3 copies, of the whole Bible sent from Cambridge, Oxford, and Westminster to London. A new choice was to be made of 6 in all, 2 out of every company to review the whole work, and extract 1 of all 3 to be committed to the press, from the dispatch of which business Mr. Downs and Mr. Bois were sent up to London. So the 2 from that company were Downs and Bois. Okay. There were, however, 2 companies each at Westminster, Cambridge, and Oxford. If Walker was correct in his number, each place, rather than each company, sent 2 men. All right? So if each place sent 2 men, there's only 3 places sending 2 men. That would be 6. If each company, 6 companies sent 2 men, that would be how many? 12. So there's a question, was it 6 or was it 12? Okay? But when Samuel Ward gave his report to the Synod of Dort in 1618, he said simply, quote, after each section had finished its book, 12 delegates chosen from them all met together and reviewed and revised the whole work. Since Ward had been a member of the Second Cambridge Company, he must have had special knowledge of the proceeding. Walker was not such a close contemporary of the learned men. So Opfeld is saying that Ward may be more likely to be believed here because he was one of the translators giving a report on what they did at the Synod of Dort in 1618 than Walker, who wrote years later, who seems to be suggesting there were 6, not 12. You guys following this? Okay. So before we go any further, does anybody have any questions about that?
Why do you think they wouldn't go through and select the best translation of each verse versus the whole? Just choosing a company that did the best job of the 3.
Well, first of all, each company only reviewed their assigned section. Okay. So this congregating of these 6 or 12 men, depending on whose account is correct, at the general meeting is to review everyone's work. So along the way, they could have been appealing to the other groups for help and insight, but the plan all along, according to Rule 10 that we just reviewed, was for all of this to be gathered together and then gone over a final time by this general meeting. So I think your understanding is pretty close to accurate, but not quite. It wasn't like all 6 companies did the whole Bible, and then the final review is going to pick which one of the 6 or 12 was the best one. That's not what happened. So at Westminster, there are 2 companies. One, I believe, if my memory is right, is doing the Apocrypha, and the other is doing the New Testament epistles. So when they had finished their work, that work would have been sent to the general meeting, and then each section would have been sent to the general meeting, and then the Committee of Final Review would have reviewed the work of all of the companies and worked out any last discrepancies, disagreements, or made changes that they deemed necessary.
Yeah. My only thinking was that they're not rewriting the Bible, they're just, making it more readable for the English. So.
Well, they are revising, yes, they are revising a bishop's Bible.
Okay, so
and
it's a significant change.
So that's what we were talking about last spring. Remember, I showed you that that's what these documents here were about. So here's the Bodleian document, the 1602 Bishop's Bible. So this Bishop's Bible here, Bart, is a record of them making changes to the text. Okay?
Yeah.
So then imagine, we don't know for sure how each company did it, but when they were done with their work, all that work got sent then to the general meeting, and then those guys went through the whole thing. Okay? But this is a record of them changing the text, revising the Bishop's Bible, 1602 Bishop's Bible, into what would ultimately become the King James. And we spent a lot of time going through that in detail last spring. Okay? So, put another way, Opheld believes that Ward's testimony regarding the size of the general meeting, 12, is to be believed over Walker's 6, given Ward's status as a translator in close connection with the project. So Opheld seems to suggest that the number 12 is probably more accurate because Samuel Ward was a translator. He was a member of the company that worked on the Apocrypha. He's giving testimony at the Synod of Dort in 1618 of what the group did in the production of the King James, whereas Walker, Bois's biographer, is writing years later. And so Opheld is suggesting that Ward knew better what actually happened than Wood. Okay? Now, that still doesn't necessarily settle it, though. Dr. David Norton also discusses this subject matter in a textual history of the King James Bible. Quote, Walker had his information from Bois. Nevertheless, what he gives us is secondhand and comes from much later after the work than does the report to the Synod of Dort. Okay? So the report is more likely to be correct about the number of translators involved in the general meeting. So if we just stopped right there, would it seem that Norton is agreeing with Opheld that 12 seems to be like the correct number just based upon all the mitigating factors? Okay? Read the next paragraph. The cause of Walker's error, if that is what it was, seems straightforward. He did not know that 2 companies worked in each place, and so presumed that there were only 3 companies. If so, we may take him as adding a minor detail to the report of the Synod of Dort that each company sent 2 delegates, but we must set a question mark against all his evidence. So in other words, he knew there were 3 places, Cambridge, Oxford, Westminster. If each sent 2, that would be 6. What maybe he did not know is that at each of the 3 places, there were 2 companies. making a total of not 3 companies, but 6. And if each company sent 2 delegates, then that would be 12, not what? Not 6, okay? What page are we on? 5, top page 5. Dr. Norton then speculates as to how Walker could also be correct. So, caveat, he's speculating about how he might also be correct. So, maybe 6 and 12 are both correct, and Norton is going to kind of explain maybe why that could be the case, although it is speculation. So, let's just preface it by saying that. Dr. Norton then speculates as to how Walker could also be correct despite giving a different number from Samuel Ward. Quote, "Yet it is possible that Walker is in his own way true. First, it is a well-based assumption, but still an assumption that there were 6 companies. This rests on the unequivocal evidence of the list of translators that there were 2 groups working in each place. The individual groups could have been thought of as divisions of single companies, subcommittees of a committee. I have already noted the possibility that there were further subdivisions. While we are accustomed to reading rules 8 to 10 as using company to refer to each of the 6 groups, Rule 13 may be read as referring to 3 companies, each with 2 heads. Quote, the directors in each company to be the deans of Westminster and Chester for that place, and the king's professors in Hebrew and Greek in each university. It is also possible that for some parts of the work, the 2 groups in one place acted as a single company. Another of Walker's details fits with this, that 3 copies of the Bible were sent to London, that is, 1 from each place. If this is true, the pairs of companies put their work together. This may also have been a simple matter of binding together the sheets of their master copies of the bishop's Bible, which would have been enough to give each pair of groups a single identity. So in other words, if you have 2 groups at Oxford, and what they did is group 1 and group 2, which were working on different parts of it, just took theirs and combined them together and sent their combination in 1 volume to the general meeting, it's conceivable that you could then say that that place only submitted 1 thing. Okay, that's what Norton is getting at, all right? This may have been a simple matter of binding together the sheets of their master copy of the bishop's Bible, etc. In short, Walker's understanding of what was meant by company may not be as wrong as it appears. This would be trifling were it not that it suggests something of the way the translators may have worked. There still seems to be the numerical problem that either there were 6 men or there were 12. We could solve this problem in 1 stroke if we change our idea of the general meeting. What if it too subdivided its work? This strains Walker's statement that the meeting was to quote, review the whole work, but might account for his confusion in a different way from that just attempted. It might also fit with Bois's notes themselves and with Walker's further statement that the work took 9 months, a statement that has been widely questioned. Okay? Now, let's make sure we understand what's going on here. Next point. As far as we know, Bois alone took notes on what transpired at the general meeting. The fact that Bois's notes cover only Romans through Revelation has caused some to wonder if the general meeting occurred in multiple sessions with different men attending each session. So in other words, why, if Bois takes copious notes of what went on from Romans to Revelation, but he was there the whole time, why are his notes not exhaustive of the discussion on the entire what? The entire Bible. Could it be that the general meeting itself was also segmented? For example, a group of 6 worked on 1 section, and a different group of 6 worked on another section. It's possible. It's a curious thing that Bois's notes are only from Romans to Revelation. It would seem to me that if Bois had been there for the whole time, from Genesis all the way through Revelation, that he would have taken corresponding notes in the same fashion on the entire thing. But his notes do not include that. They only start at Romans and go through Revelation. Next sentence. According to this theory, Bois only took notes on Romans through Revelation because that was the only portion he was present for. It does seem strange that if Bois were present for the entire general meeting, why did he only take notes on Romans through Revelation? Professor Norton speculates that a series of meetings could account for the different number of attendees in the accounts of Walker 6 and Ward 12. So imagine now there's a series of meetings, maybe 2, maybe 3, I don't know, but there's a series of meetings and maybe there's 6 men at each, and so maybe they're all, each right in their own way. Are you following that? And the segmented nature of Bois's notes are also a factor in this conversation. Quote, Allen has shown that Bois's notes are consistent with the idea of 9 months' work taking place in 1610. The notes contains page references to a volume of Chrism that appeared in 1610, but not to a volume that appeared in 1611, showing that the notes were made in 1610, so lending credibility to the 9 months. This is, I think, beyond doubt. It raises a major question. What happened in 1609, the year that Ayer's letter suggested when the general meeting convened? If the general meeting was not as general as has been previously supposed, the answer could be this, that it did different parts of the work at different times involving different people. This idea has the further attraction that would help account for the puzzling features of Bois's notes. As I already said, Bois's notes are remarkably incomplete if the general meeting involved all who attended it working through the entire text, and in so doing, making at a minimum 1/6, but possibly as much as half of the textual changes that were still to be made. The notes cover discussion of the epistles and Revelation only, forcing one to ask whether he was present only for this part of the work. Either he took no notes on the bulk of the work, or he was only involved in this part. You guys following this? Okay? So we're trying to reconcile here a few factors. We're trying to reconcile, number one, the different accounts for how many translators were at the general meeting, and second, the state of Bois's notes only being on Romans through Revelation. A second puzzling feature of Bois's notes is that they do not account for all of the work that had been done on the epistles and Revelation. Much more work happened between the preparation of manuscript 98 and the printing of the text than his notes account for. 2,974 changes were made independently of the preparation of manuscript 98, but Bois records just under 500 items of discussion, the majority of which concerned the originals rather than the particulars of English translation. Even if each of these items of discussion led to a change of the text, which did not happen, they would account for less than a 1/12 of the changes. It may be he did not record all the discussions he was present for, but somewhere and somehow there is significantly more work to be accounted for. Now, does everybody understand what Norton is saying? If you take manuscript 98 and you compare it with the items discussed, there's still more changes that happened between the creation of manuscript 98 and the publication of the actual Bible in 1611 than Bois would account for in his notes of the final discussion at the general meeting. Okay, so despite their importance as primary source witnesses, despite their importance as a primary source witness to what transpired at the general meeting, Bois's notes do not offer a complete picture. Simply stated, even with Bois's notes, there are still details related to the general meeting that we simply do not know. We just don't know. All right, anybody got any questions or comments? Look, I know this can get a little bit technical. I hope you're not bored, but this is what we can know about what happened at the general meeting, all right? Any questions before we move on? Okay, one such question, another question then is, who were the translators that were at the general meeting? Well, we know one guy for sure, Bois, because he took the notes, okay? One such question is the identities of all of the translators who took part in the general meeting. Olga S. Opfeld addresses this question in the King James Bible Translators, quote, "Of the men who met at Stationers' Hall, whether 6 or 12, only 3 names are known with certainty. John Bois and Andrew Downes of the Second Cambridge Company and John Harmer of the Second Oxford Company. The notes contain some scattered initials which are identified only in one case. At the end, the manuscript says, quote, AD, so often occurring, signifies Andrew Downes, Greek professor in Cambridge. Such frequent mention might well signify enthusiasm, if not extreme diligence, but Walker reported that Downes, quote, would not go to Stationers' Hall unless he was either fetched or threatened with a pursuit. That would be like a fine. So he's like wanting to hang out and do whatever, and he had to be summoned according to one source, primary source related to this, okay? So, besides AD is Andrew Downes, excuse me. Besides AD, the initials B, C, H, and DH appear at various times. Several of the translators bore one or the other of these initials. H might well stand for John Harmer. D, Hutch, and Hutch also occurring may indicate notes left by Dr. Ralph Hutchinson of the Second Westminster Company, who died in 1604. Okay, now, I should tell you that Opfeld's book was written in 1980. So in the intermittent, near 40 years, 42 years, something like that, a little bit more is known about this, which we'll get to in a minute. Ward Allen also comments upon the initials noted in Boyce's notes in translating for King James. Quote, further evidence of the authenticity of the notes comes from their scattered jottings of names and initials of translators. Most frequently mentioned is AD, noted at the end of the manuscript identifies these initials as Andrew Downes. Until the discovery of these notes, Bois and Downes were the only 2 translators known to have sat on the company. In addition to the initials AD are the personal references to Bois in the notes. The following notations appear. C at Romans 4:11, H at Romans 9:5, DH at 1 Timothy 1:6 and Hebrews 2:7 through 9, D Hutch and Hutch at Hebrews 5:15 and Revelation 13:8, and in the addenda for 1 Corinthians 6:4, the initial B at Hebrews 12:23 and D Harmer at 1 Peter 2:24 and Revelation 13:5. D Harmer is Dr. Harmer, we know this pretty clearly, is Dr. Harmer of the Oxford Company, which translated the Gospels, the Acts, and the Apocalypse. Dr. Hutchinson is not Dr. Ralph Hutchinson of the Westminster Company, which translated the epistles of St. Paul and the canonical epistles, for if the records be accurate, Ralph Hutchinson had died 4 years before the Company of Review assembled. From the wording of the note to the addenda, Dr. D. Hutch, I don't know how to pronounce that, Querbat, it seems unlikely that the comments represent notes which Dr. Hutchinson left upon his death. So Opfeld and Allen don't agree about that. Most likely another Hutch had been appointed to the body of translators. It is impossible to ascertain from the single initials, which of the translators may have been designated, for more than one translator bore each of the single initials cited. The three known translators of the Authorized Version conferring as these notes were assembled were John Bois, Andrew Downes, and John Harmon. Okay? Now, it gets more interesting. It always does, right? A more recent essay. So let's just take stock. Ward Allen wrote his book in 1969. Opheld wrote her book in 1980. All right? And we're trying to figure out who this Hutch, D. Hutch is. Is that the right one? Yeah. D. Hutch or Hutch. In a more recent essay by Mordecai Feingold in a 2018 anthology titled Laborers in the Vineyard of the Lord, Scholarship in the Making of the King James Bible, suggests the possibility that Dr. Ralph Hutchinson had not passed away and was present at the general meeting. Specifically, Feingold writes, quote, in a similar manner, we learn of the contribution of Ralph Hutchinson, prebend of St. Paul's. John Boyce's note suggests his involvement in the revision committee, which is substantiated by a document dated 29 February 1611, 1612, acquitting Hutchinson of the charge of simony. Now, if you don't know what simony is, simony would be the selling of a church position for money. So selling a church position for money is simony. Acquitting him, where it is mentioned that he had been, quote, lately employed in the translation of the Bible. So now we have a discrepancy about whether Ralph Hutchinson was alive or dead at the general meeting. If he was still alive, then probably those notations would relate to him. Okay? So here is the Cecil papers dated February 1612 on the British History Online. Okay? And if we go down here far enough, we can see very plainly right here. See this entry right here? 1611, 1612, 29 February. And then I'll direct your attention to this entry right here. A pardon to William Hutchinson, Doctor of Divinity, one lately employed in the translation of the Bible, and parson of Ken in the Diocese of Exon, is, in respect of a simony, objected against him for that same of his friends having agreed with the patron of a said parsonage of, I'm assuming this is 300 pounds, to present Dr. Hutchinson the said parsonage when void as he did. So this guy, he's ultimately going to be acquitted, but you'll notice the name William Hutchinson, a doctor of divinity, and this statement lately employed in the translation of what? But you'll notice, this guy's name is William. He says in the book that the guy's name is Ralph. But it's clearly what? William. It's just all these turns. It's always interesting, okay? So look at the next point. This assertion by Feingold is odd and goes against the prevailing opinion that Dr. Hutchinson passed away in 1606. Feingold cites the Historical Manuscript Commission calendar of the manuscripts of the Marquis of Salisbury presented at Hatfield House as support for this assertion. Christopher Yetzer sees no way around concluding that Dr. Ralph Hutchinson passed away in 1606, stating in personal correspondence, quote, another person took over at St. John's College and a specific date of his death is given. My research turned up a William Hutchinson matching the description mentioned by Feingold. I found the following in a list of entries dated 29 February 1611, 1612 on the website British History Online, which is right here, and there's the statement. A pardon to William Hutchinson, Doctor of Divinity, one lately employed in the translation of the Bible, etc. Now he's going to be acquitted of the charge of simony. In other words, he did not commit the charge. Go to top of page 8. So here's what I believe is going on. It appears that Feingold may have confounded William Hutchinson with Ralph Hutchinson. Gordon Campbell states the following in his book, Bible, the Story of the King James Version, 1611 to 2011. He says, quote, Bois notes also refer to Hutch, which cannot refer to Ralph Hutchinson, who had been appointed to the Second Westminster Company but had died in 1606 before work had begun at the general meeting. It therefore seems likely that the reference is to Lancelot Andrews's colleague, William Hutchinson, a prebend of St. Paul and archdeacon of St. Albans, who had not been one of the translators, but who had been brought in at a late stage for the revision committee. No other names are known. So Campbell is saying that Hutch is a reference not to Ralph Hutchinson, but to William Hutchinson, which corresponds to this historical document that explicitly states that he had been lately employed in the translation of what? The Bible, okay? So, if that's true, that means we know 4 names, not 3. We know Bois, we know Andrew Downes, we know John Harmer, and we know William Hutchinson. 4 names of potentially 6 or 12. Okay?
Were both William and Ralph accused of simony, or was that a confusing? Because it sounded like if they were both accused, maybe it was the same person. But
Ralph died,
yeah,
indisputably died in 1606. So when this Feingold gentleman wrote his chapter, he obviously got mixed up, and he literally calls him Ralph when the source he is citing says what? William.
Oh, okay. So only one was accused of that.
Right.
Pardon.
Because Ralph was already dead.
Yeah.
Okay. So my collation of Boyce's notes reveals at least 97 occurrences. Now, I'm not claiming this figure is exact, but at least 97 occurrences of the initials AD for Andrew Downes are found therein. 97 times the initials for Andrew Downes occur in Boyce's notes, right? Downes is the most frequently mentioned translator in Boyce's notes by a long shot. Initials for other translators do not occur more than 5 times in Boyce's notes. So Hutch, Harmer, the other guys that are mentioned, the other guys who are unidentifiable by the single initials, none of those individually occur more than 5 times, most of them not more than twice. But Downes occurs at least 97 times. All right? Walker's statement about Downes being, quote, fetched or threatened raises an interesting question regarding the grounds upon which Downes could have been forced to comply or report to Stationers' Hall if summoned. It is believed, based upon statements from Walker, that the participants in the general meeting were paid by the Stationers' Company to partake in this portion of the work. Oldfelt states the following regarding this matter. Quote, this time there were concrete financial arrangements. Walker noted that they went daily to Stationers' Hall and in 3/4 of a year finished their task. All which time they had from the company of stationers X shillings per week duly paid them, though they had nothing before but their self-rewarding ingenious industry. It has been suggested that the money came from the, quote, Bible stock, a company within the Stationers' Company, or from Robert Barker, the King's printer. But it appears that these men that were in the general meeting did get financial compensation for their time. Before this, there is no evidence that they received anything for their work on this project. Okay? So assuming the veracity of Walker's statement, we can deduce the following. Only the translators who participated in the general meeting received compensation for their work on the project. To this, Gordon Campbell adds, quote, the stationer's company contributed to the project by paying each of the revisers 30 shillings a week, which was a generous rate at the time. Okay? So, in conclusion, please consider the following summary statement from the pen of Helen Moore and Julian Reed in Manifold Greatness, The Making of the King James Bible. Bois made notes concerning points of interest arising from the meeting's discussion. A record of these notes survives in a 17th century copy of a copy made by the theologian and antiquarian William Fulman of Corpus Christi College, Oxford. Fulman left his papers, to the corpus. And it has been among these that Bois's notes were discovered in the 1950s. Bois's notes are in Latin and relate to the general meaning's discussion of the epistles and Revelation. They reflect his own scholarly interest in points of linguistic detail and made frequent reference to the opinions of his former Cambridge tutor and religious professor of Greek, Andrew Downes, also a member of this review committee. Bois's notes constitute ample proof of the pair's renowned learning in Greek and provide a fascinating insight into the process of revision that shaped the final text of the King James Bible, although they do not account for all of the changes that took place in the final stages of the translation. As well as recording the translator's intricate scholarly debates, Bois's notes also reveal a degree of attention to the matter of English idiom, that's how it sounds in what language, English, and some concern with the style and register of the translation. So that's a summary, guys, of sort of the history of Bois's notes. We've looked in this lesson at, the discrepancies between the number of translators present. We've seen that we can identify 4 of the translators who were there, and we've seen that they were paid for their work by the Stationers' Hall according to the records, but that prior to that in the process, nobody seems to have received any compensation for their work. Okay? So, any questions about the lesson? Okay, if there are no questions, just a brief reminder, we will have class next week at 9 o'clock, but Eli is going to be bringing the lesson. We will resume this on October, I think it's going to be October 2nd, Sunday, October 2nd, and we'll kind of go the next step in looking at this material regarding Bois and the general meaning. So, if there are no questions, I'm going to end the stream and clean up the equipment and so forth, move on with our Sunday.